What is up, guys? We are about to see if the Goldwing starts. Now it's been a long couple days, and yes, I own 3 of these shirts, so if it looks like I've been wearing the same shirt, I assure you I have not. But here goes nothing. Key comes on, that's good. See what we got. Give it a minute. That was loud. Well, guys, it doesn't start. Don't tell the guy at the beginning of the video that it doesn't start. We did fix the noise, so that's good. Let's get this video started. What's going on, guys? Matt with MotoWorks here. And in this Worth It series, I do things a little different. As you see, I showed you the end result. So you guys now know the future and what's going to happen after I do all this work. So you're already going to know if this bike runs or not because you've already seen the end of the video. And I did that on purpose because, listen guys, I'm a realist. I understand that people just fast forward to the end just to see the result. So I'm just going to play that for you at the beginning of my videos, and then that way, hopefully, if you're still intrigued and want to watch the videos, you will. And I greatly appreciate those of you that stick it out throughout the entire video. We are going to get started on the 1986 Goldwing. There are a few things I want to point out before we get started, so let's get right into it. Now, the first thing is, I guess I have to prove that the bike doesn't start. And I'm just going to do that by cranking it over. Now this bike does make a horrendous sound when I'm cranking it over, so I'm not going to crank it over a lot. I believe it might be a collapsed lifter. I'm not certain, but it doesn't sound like it's anything detrimental. Hopefully not. You're probably screaming at the screen right now because you know more than I do, but I'm just going to crank it over. And it's making a horrible tapping sound, but it doesn't do it every time, so I think it's possible that one of the lifters might be collapsed. And if that's the case, then I'll probably have to get a new lifter, but it sounds horrible, but it does crank over, and as you saw, it did not start. Now, I'm not going to keep cranking it to see if I can actually try and get it to start, because that many cranks, it should have done something, and it did absolutely nothing. So if you're having an issue where your bike won't start and it's been sitting for I'd say longer than 9 months. If it's been sitting for around a year and it won't start and it's carbureted like this one is, then 9 times out of 10, you've got an issue with your carburetors. I know I have an issue with these carburetors because this thing has been sitting for at least 5 years not running. Now, some things you can do beforehand to diagnose if it is a carburetor related issue or something else. You can take the spark plugs out and you can put them up against the engine here. I'll do that in a couple seconds, and you could just check to see if it has spark. Now I'm going to try and keep that type of diagnostic low because, again, it's making a horrible sound, so I don't want to keep making that noise. But just to show you guys real quick what you can do is first verify that it has spark, and then you just go down through the process of compression, leak down, and then ultimately you end up at the carburation. Alrighty, so the way to test for spark is actually pretty simple. Come down here, and you want to pull all your spark plug wires and plugs out of the engine, and then you want to just take every spark plug, put it back into the spark plug boot like that, and then you just ground it out on something metal such as the frame here or the engine. And you want to do that to all the spark plugs. You want to pull all the spark plugs out at the same time, put them all back into the spark plug boot here, and actually ground them all out and check for spark at the same time. Now, like I said, I'm not going to run this because I don't want to keep pounding on that lifter. If that is the case, that lifter's collapsed, I kind of want to give it a fighting chance and get it running and actually pump it up, hopefully. And if I keep banging on it here without starting it, without having proper oil pressure, I think it's just going to keep damaging it. So the way you test for spark is you just ground out the spark plugs while they're hooked up there. The reason you pull them all out is because I've already had instances where I just tested one and left everything else hooked up, and it actually will still start even with one spark plug out of the cylinder. It'll still start, still run. And if you're testing for spark and that's the case, it could be a potential that gas is spitting out of that hole because obviously it's not being burned. It can get on that spark plug and you can start a fire. So pull all the spark plugs out, get them away from the holes here. You know, test your spark somewhere away from the spark plug holes, because if there is gas coming out, yes, you could catch it on fire. So I already tested this for spark before. I don't know where that tapping noise has come from, and that's why I think it's a lifter that has collapsed, because I actually had this bike running on starting fluid. That's about all I've had it running on. So I do know that it runs. I do know that it sounds good. I don't know where that lifter tap came from. And the only thing I can think of is it bled down and now it has it. But yeah, you test for spark. Then the next thing you do is you test for compression, which again, I already know this runs. I already know the compression's good on this. And to test for compression, you just get a compression tester, you put it down into your spark plug hole and you crank it over. You do that, you repeat that on the other remaining cylinders. If you have good compression and you have spark, you know that the potential issue is the carburetors, which again, this bike's been sitting long, so I'm just going to take the carburetors off now. One thing I will tell you is if you're working on a bike, car, anything, and it's a cold day, try your best to get this thing heated up. I have a space heater over here, just a turbo heater, and I have it blasting on the bike because you don't want to work on this stuff cold. Reason being, stuff when it gets cold gets very brittle, and again, when we talk about something being worth it, if parts start breaking on this, it becomes less and less worth it the more the stuff breaks. So in order to keep the cost low, I'm just going to heat this thing up. Alrighty guys, so we've had our first catastrophe here. So I was taking this part of the air box here, this is the top half, and then that's the bottom half of the air box. And I was taking it apart, and I got 1, 2, 3 screws out without a problem. Got to this last screw here, and you can see how it's all mangled up. And I found that it was stripped out because it was rusted fast to the nut on the bottom here. So this isn't going to be a difficult fix, but to get it out was a pain in the butt. I ended up having to take the shroud off, seat off, and it's actually taken way longer than it should have. But that's what happens with these older bikes. You get these screws and they just fight you. And this one here, it's not going to win. I'm going to get that screw out. It's just, now that just adds to the job. Alrighty guys, we got the carburetors off the Goldwing. What a pain in the butt that was. Took us about 2 hours. Had the issue with the airbox screws, and I also cleaned up the lift a little bit because I'm going to get ready for an oil change. And I put the spark plugs back in. I put a fresh set of spark plugs in, and I covered up the intake holes here. Anytime you take something off, whether it's fuel injection, carburation, if you've got an open engine, you want to just cover that up. I tape these holes shut. You could stuff some paper towels in there. I don't recommend doing that. I recommend taping or putting something flat on top. That way something doesn't accidentally get in there, and then when you pull the paper towel out, it falls in, you don't see it. So tape works well. Just block the holes up anytime you remove something from the engine. Carburetors are over here. I did take them apart a little bit to show you what's going on inside, and it's not good. It's disgusting in there. So if you look at this guy here, it's full of what I like to call green growies. It's disgusting, and the float bowl looks the same too. Nice and green. That's really, really dirty. And this would be the right side carburetor, which doesn't make sense. I would have thought the left side carburetor would have been dirtier because of being on the side stand. Typically all the fuel would have, but who knows? That's the way it is. It's just dirtier on the right side here. Now if we flip these over, I'm going to show you common things wrong with carburation, especially on a bike that's been sitting. These diaphragms here, these are only rubber, and what happens over time, this one's actually stuck inside the cylinder bore here. Okay, so what can happen? I got that to break free. What can happen is these diaphragms here, pull this up so you can see it. Just be very gentle, especially these older diaphragms here. What can happen is they can tear, and if they tear, you have to replace the whole entire piece. So if this little diaphragm tears, you have to replace this whole assembly, minus this needle here, but this whole assembly needs to be replaced if you get a tear in one of these. And if you get a tear in one of these, the bike's not going to want to rev up. Because the way these diaphragm slides work is as you open the throttle, air comes in through here, passes through these carburetors, and there's just little valleys, little pockets up here. And those pockets come in through this side here, and they actually put air pressure under these diaphragms. And as long as these diaphragms have no tears in them, they're going to rise and lower without a problem. They rise up from that pressure pushing on them, and these diaphragms basically inflating, and then they lower with these springs that sit under these caps here. So the spring puts pressure on it, pushes it back down. You get it. So when you're doing this, the first thing you want to look at before you take this apart are these diaphragms here. And if any of them are torn, make sure you can get them before you spend all the time cleaning the carburetors and even starting to get into that job, because these can be expensive. I think these are almost $100 a slide. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So you've got potentially $400 in diaphragms that you would need to get. Now, yes, it is true. You could take these off and actually look at these before you start this job, because these are accessible while the carburetors are still in the bike. So it might be something to consider doing before you start this job, and maybe, hey, you get a set of carburetors from another bike that has a known good set, and maybe those carburetors are in good shape. You could just take yours off and put those on, but you're not going to go anywhere if you have tears in these slides here. So these look good on here. The only issue I saw is they are gummed up like crazy under here. While I'm here, I'm going to be replacing the fuel lines, vacuum lines, anything that I see, I'm just going to replace, especially if it's cracked, dry rotted. At this point, that's the time to do it. So look for tears in those diaphragms first thing, and then take your carburetors apart and just assess them, see what they're looking like. These aren't looking terrible. I am going to be separating them, which is pretty simple. You just take this, disconnect this rod here. I'm going to be taking these apart, taking this half carburetor off, dipping it into cleaner, this half, dipping it into cleaner, and then right before I put them back together, I'll show you guys what they look like. But carburetors are off. They are gummed up, so that is definitely the reason why these did not run. Alrighty guys, so just a quick little update. I just want to show you the difference between the carburetors. So this is the clean side here. This was the dirtier of the two sides. So this one took a long time to get clean. This one's still dirty. I have to take that apart and clean everything up. But I just wanted to show you guys, you know, the difference between them. And the throttle actually is starting to work better now that I cleaned them. That's just how dirty that side was. Still returns slowly because this side is gummed up, but it's getting there. Alrighty guys, so the carburetors are back together. At least on this side. I removed the left side bank of carburetors and I have them soaking. Kind of have to do one half at a time, put this half in, flip it over and do the other half. And while those were soaking, I ended up bleeding all the lifters. There was only one lifter that actually needed bled, but I bled them all so they're all pumped up. And then I also removed these little caps here. These are just little oil galleys. They were completely dry. I mean, these heads have been sitting not running for a long time, so all the oil actually bled back down into the engine. So I just put a bunch of oil in here, actually oiled a bunch of these parts, and again I bled the lifters. It was the left side rear exhaust lifter that was making all that noise because that lifter was completely collapsed. Well, it wasn't collapsed, it was just out of oil. Basically it bled itself dry. So I pumped it up, and again I pumped all these up, checked them, they're all good. I did crank it over. I'm not going to keep trying to crank this over just to show you and to prove a point. I'm going to run it, and then you'll hear it. It'll either sound good or it'll sound like crap. But I'm putting this back together, and upon doing so, I found that this valve cover here, if you look, I did a little video of it, it's actually broken. So I don't know if this bike was down at some point and maybe this front cover here bashed into the valve cover, or maybe somebody took it apart and put it together wrong. I don't really see how you could do that, but if you look, it's actually pretty damaged. And I was wondering why there's oil seeping on this left-hand side, and it makes sense now because this valve cover is actually busted. So I am going to need to get a valve cover. Alrighty guys, we got the carburetors all back together. Now what I'm doing here with this fuel line or fuel IV is I'm just bench testing my carburetors right now, making sure that they aren't going to leak fuel. I do that outside of the bike. I don't like to figure out they don't work inside the bike. So far so good. I've had the fuel line hooked up for about 10 minutes now and there's no fuel leaking out of the carburetors. I cracked every drain screw. Each carburetor has filled up with fuel, so I do know that there's fuel in them. I'm probably going to let these sit for about 15-20 minutes just to verify that they don't leak and I'm not going to have a problem. Now that we clean the carburetors, if you look at the throttles here, that just snaps right back just like it should. These carburetors were nasty. The choke is the same thing. That works just like it should. I can actually probably just activate the choke from over here, and that's turning all the chokes on now. So these carburetors are clean, and so far they are leak free. We're going to get ready to put them back on the bike. Well guys, that's a bummer. All that work and it still doesn't start. Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo. That was loud. I'm going to show you now why it doesn't start. Alrighty guys, now remember in the video when I said you should test for spark and make sure it has spark? Well, I didn't, and it doesn't. Well, the front cylinder has spark, and that's what made that loud backfire. The rear cylinder does not have spark. A nice spark. No spark. Nice spark. No spark. That's no bueno. I have to grab some ignition testing equipment to diagnose that problem further, but this is the stuff I'm talking about. Now, had this not been making a horrendous noise when I was cranking it over initially, I would have been able to test the spark, and I would have seen that the bike was getting no spark at the rear cylinders. But I didn't, and I just went off of the previous assumption because I did have this running before. It did have spark at all 4 cylinders, so I didn't really feel the need to test it. Obviously now I should have, but that's neither here nor there. I'm still going to test it, and hey, I can show you guys how I do that in the next edition or next episode. But the bike doesn't start. We did clean the carburetors. I know that that's not the issue with the bike. Carburetors are spotless. This thing wants to run. It's just not going to run on only 2 cylinders and 2 opposing cylinders. But it might actually run if, you know, I was getting spark diagonally or spark on one side. It actually might have started, but the time from when it sparks on this one to when it sparks on that side over there, there's too long in between, and that's why it's just loading up and spitting a big backfire out. Next episode, we're going to be diagnosing an ignition system, and we're probably going to be tackling the brakes and throwing a set of tires on here, because either way, I'm going to get this thing running, and then we're going to look at the overall total, see how much money it has cost us to get this thing running. So far, if you're keeping score, it was about $100 for the jet kit, and the bike doesn't even run yet, and we put some spark plugs in, so we're probably in parts, we're probably close to $130. Well, actually, we did the oil change, and I pumped up that lifter, so between parts and labor, we're probably up to about $600 or $700, and that would be on the low end of labor. That's figuring if labor was about $50 an hour, you know, and that's what I'll kind of base this off of, a $50 an hour labor time, which in 2021 is probably unheard of unless you're going to a buddy of yours. But yeah, we're at about $600 or $700, maybe even more, and the bike still doesn't start. So again, when we look at the total overall picture, is it worth it? I don't know, we'll find out. But that's it for this video, guys. Thanks for checking it out. Thank you so much for subscribing, commenting, and liking the videos. We'll see you in the next one.